Hello guys, today I'm going to talk about all the custom object stuff that I ended up putting together for my latest custom Super Mario Bros. Wonder level. So I will explain how I made the Skeblaster acorn cannons and these blocks that appear during the level's Wonder effect, and also how I fixed the original game's on-off blocks, which in turn temporarily broke my level, which almost caused me to give up on the whole thing. If you haven't seen my two previous custom actor videos, I'd recommend watching those first, because I'm not going to explain the same process multiple times. Alright, so let's start with the Skeblasters. I'm pretty sure I've sat on the idea for this custom mechanic for over a year now, because it was that long ago that I first started messing around with the game's child actor param files. Child in this case doesn't mean an actual kid, but just an object that is in some way under the control of or spawned by another actor, which is its metaphorical parent. So when a hammer bro throws a hammer, that projectile is the child actor and the hammer bro is the parent actor. And that connection is stored in these child actor param files. And as you may have guessed, it works the same way for both the acorns that Skedaddlers shoot and the bullet bills fired by bullet bill blasters. So making a blaster shoot acorns instead is as simple as going into the Skedaddler's child actor file, copying over the name of its projectile, and then going into the bullet bill blaster's child actor file and replacing the name there with the one we copied. However, I didn't want to straight up replace the existing bullet bill blasters, so instead I made a copy of all the different versions of the actor that I then modified. The internal name for bullet bills is Killer, and the internal name for these acorn projectiles is Uzapio Egg. So for my Skeblasters, I turned Object Killer Hodai into Object Uzapio Egg Hodai, including a bunch of variations for the versions of the blasters that face in different directions. Although actually, most of these versions of the Skeblasters that face in other directions ended up being redundant, because the acorn projectiles don't function properly when shot in any direction other than horizontally. Anyways, on top of making these custom actor pack files, I also had to add a new file into the child actor param folder to tell the game which type of projectile to put into the blasters, and that worked. Just like the coin blasters in the original game, I decided to change the color of the Skeblasters to make them match their projectiles. Whereas the coin blasters feature a simple coin emblem, I decided to put a Skedaddler face onto my blaster since that sort of matches the skull symbol on the original bullet bill blaster. I originally made this Skedaddler icon design that matches their in-game proportions perfectly, but that was difficult to make out from a distance, so I changed the proportions to make the details easier to distinguish. So weirdly, making the icon less accurate made it easier to tell what it was meant to represent. And that's all for the Skeblasters, so now let's talk about these blocks that appear in the level's Wonder effect. During the design process of this level, these blocks were just the yellow dotted line blocks seen in the World 6 airship of the original game. However, as I was finishing up the level, I realized that this made the whole Skedaddler activating blocks mechanic less memorable than it could be, so I decided to give it some visual flair by changing the look of the block. So these custom blocks are just a duplicate of the yellow blocks with no altered functionality. The Skedaddler activation is all handled with setups within the level itself. As for those custom visuals, my first instinct was to make the blocks match the Skeblasters, meaning I tried putting the same Skedaddler icon onto them. However, what works for an object of which maybe 2 or 3 appear on screen at once doesn't have to work amazingly well for an object of which there can be dozens on screen at the same time. So even though these Skedaddler faces made it very clear what triggered the blocks, this also looked extremely goofy, so I scrapped that idea. After a bit more iterating, I decided to just give the Skedaddler blocks a very simple recolored version of the texture used for these blue Wonder blocks. Getting a duplicate of an existing actor to load a different model without this also influencing the original actor is a bit of a finicky process that involves renaming a bunch of files. And because of the unique way the layering of the block and dotted line textures of these blocks is handled, it took me a while to figure this stuff out for this particular custom actor. But I'll spare you the details in this case, because this stuff is as boring as it is complicated. Though something which ended up being both complicated and interesting, I think, is what happened with this level's on-off blocks. So as I've explained in quite a number of videos at this point, some objects in Super Mario Bros. Wonder don't have dedicated collision, because levels have an additional layer of pre-baked collision which these objects rely on. Probably the most noteworthy actor type for which this is the case in the original game is on-off blocks. All of the variations of these blocks that gain or lose collision depending on which color is activated don't have any collision when placed outside of their positions in the original game's levels. Now, technically, this was never a super devastating problem. Other types of on-off mechanics are still usable by default, and recreating the functionality of on-off blocks using other objects is also feasible. However, as it turns out, giving on-off blocks proper collision is so easy that bothering with alternatives isn't even worth thinking about. The majority of actors in Super Mario Bros. Wonder allow their movement to be bound to that of another actor using a bind link. This is what's used for all the rotating coins and other moving elements in the original game. But on-off blocks are an exception to this. Their movement can't be bound to anything else. However, a few months ago, a person by the name of Thea figured out how to make bindable versions of actors which originally didn't have this functionality. All you have to do is add this model bind param file into a duplicate of the original actor and reference the name of that file properly within the rest of the actor's file structure. But the crazy thing about this is that when applied to the on-off block actors, this fixes their collision. Okay, but why? I'm not 100% sure, but I think the only reason most tile-based actors do have proper collision is because they're bindable. The thing about that static invisible collision layer in levels is that, well, it's static, so movable objects need to have their own collision. And because most actors in the game have the ability to be bound and thus move, this is apparently what the game uses to automatically determine whether an actor should have its own collision or not. So yeah, making a bindable duplicate of both the red and blue on-off block actor allowed me to use them in my level. So what is that catastrophic problem that I mentioned at the start of the video? Well, let's talk about the limits of Super Mario Bros. Wonder's levels. If you're watching this, you're likely familiar with the Super Mario Maker games, and the fact that those only allow you to place so many of a certain type of object in each level area. In the case of that game, this limit is programmed into the editor side of things to prevent the player from causing lag or ballooning the level's file size, I suppose, but the limits I'm about to discuss aren't pre-programmed. I first encountered one of Wonder's level limits when working on the level Melon Meltdown. At a certain point, towards the end of development, the game stopped loading in the new links I was placing. Links, if you're not aware, are the connections between actors that allow them to talk to each other in some way, like the bind link I explained earlier. And as it turned out, I'd used too many of them throughout this particular level, which made a lot of sense because I was kind of spamming links in places where they weren't strictly necessary. So after changing that, the problem was gone, and I could finish my level. A few custom levels later, I ran into a much more scary limit, however, the actor limit. To this day, Snow-Capped Stampede is probably the biggest, craziest level I've made in some ways, which turned out to be a problem as I was finishing up the level, since the more new actors I placed, the more older actors throughout the level were randomly disappearing. That particular level featured a lot of snow blocks, which are all individual actors, so the solution in that case was as simple as removing a large amount of the snow blocks that didn't serve much of a purpose. Across all the level's areas, Snow-Capped Stampede ended up with around 1400 actors in total, so I logically assumed that was roughly the limit I should stay under for future levels. So you can imagine my surprise when, whilst working on the wonder effect of Skeblasters Scurry, I seemingly ran into the actor limit once again, even though at that point the level only used around 700 actors. My first clue that something was up was whilst setting up the wonder effect, I noticed that sometimes Skedaddlers would try to shoot their acorn projectiles, but nothing would come out. Because these acorns are technically separate actors from the Skedaddlers, them shooting one means the level has to load in a new actor, which doesn't work if the level has hit the actor limit. My second clue was a bit more obvious though, because at a certain point my level started crashing. Still, it took me a while to realize that I'd hit the actor limit because that didn't make any sense. Why would the limit be so much lower in this case compared to my previous custom levels? When I did figure out I'd hit the limit, my first assumption was that maybe each level slot had a different pre-programmed limit of some sort, so I'd just gotten unlucky by putting this level into a slot with very little space. However, that clearly wasn't the case, because moving my level to a different slot didn't change anything. So I ended up just sort of messing with random aspects of my level, removing sections, moving parts into sub-areas, that sort of stuff, for several days in a row, trying to get different results and a clue as to what's going on based on that. I should emphasize just how desperate I started feeling during this period. If I couldn't figure out what was going on, the level would be doomed and I'd have wasted several weeks of work without even being able to get a single video out of any of this. In fact, I was considering making a much more depressing version of this video you're watching right now, where I explained all the custom actor stuff and the problem I ran into without any kind of solution. Speaking of which though, at some point I thought maybe the custom actors were the culprit, so I went into the level's YAML file and replaced every custom actor with a generic block. Even though doing this did not change the amount of actors in the level now loaded fine. This sent me down a rabbit hole of trying to remake the custom actors, looking for something I'd done wrong, but I ended up realizing that the problem was much more simple than that. Even though I'm not much of a Super Mario Maker player, the precedent of there being such a cut and dry limit on the amount of objects in a level area in those games had made me assume something similar would apply to Wonder. But of course, that really makes no sense. Some actors are more complicated or more resource intensive than others. Loading a stone block or the final Bowser fight are not an equivalent process. So the reason the level didn't crash when I replaced all the custom actors with stone blocks is because those are less resource intensive than the custom actors I'd used throughout the level. I'd only used a dozen or so Skeblasters, but literally hundreds of on-off block actors in the level, so this realization led me to devising a plan. Because I needed some way of reducing the amount of on-off block actors in the level, preferably without changing the level structure. I think Nintendo's designers were also very aware of the actor limit, because the original game features some objects that specifically seem to exist to avoid using an unnecessarily large amount of actors. For example, instead of making a staircase like this out of loads of separate block actors, this generic block staircase formation is one giant pre-made object. And another way the game avoids the actor limit is through array blocks. Some of Super Mario Bros. Wonder's block types, which often appear in rows or columns, have this special feature where when their actor is resized, instead of the block's model being stretched, it just repeats. This allows setups like this wall to actually be made of a single actor that's just stretched to form this larger shape. So turning my custom bindable on-off blocks into an array object would allow me to cut back on the amount of on-off block actors in the level significantly. As it turns out, this feature is handled by this draw array model info component, so after adding that to my custom on-off blocks and finagling with the model references a bit, I managed to get the array functionality to work. However, this came at a cost, because now the dotted lines that normally appear in the place of the on-off blocks when they're not activated weren't appearing. So I decided to make another set of custom actors that would load the dotted line model separately, which I could then place behind the on-off blocks. This meant I now technically needed 2 actors just to make one on-off block, which was kind of counterintuitive considering I was doing all of this to reduce the amount of actors in the level. However, being able to make sections like these with only 2 actors for each row of blocks greatly compensated for this problem regardless. So yeah, I remade all the on-off block setups throughout the level with my more efficient actors, and the problem was finally solved. And that's gonna do it for this video, guys. If you have any suggestions for other ways I might be able to turn the game's existing actors into something custom for a level, please let me know by leaving a comment. And while you're down there, I'd also appreciate it if you considered leaving a like on the video, or subscribing, or becoming a channel member to get early access to future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!